of our guests this afternoon. It's good to see you again, Secretary of State, and I believe this is your first appearance at this committee, Minister Hollingbury. So thank you very much for your attending today and helping us out with our Brexit and trade inquiry. Just for the record, who you are and anything by way of a short introductory statement. When will we start with you, Secretary of State?
Yes, Chairman, I'll make a short opening statement, and I begin by thanking you and the committee clerks for your forbearance with the logistics of bringing this session together. Mr Hollingbury and I are most grateful for that. We're grateful for the opportunity to appear before the committee today. And as you are aware, Mr Hollingbury is the Minister for Trade Policy within the Department of International Trade, and although he's never appeared before this committee before, he has appeared on behalf of the UK Government in the Scottish Parliament. I think that from the start I would make clear the Government's position in relation to leaving the EU and trade matters. Leaving the EU offers us an opportunity to negotiate our own trade agreements and to be a positive and powerful force for free trade. We'll be able to set tariffs for our trade with the rest of the world and have the ability to secure trade deals with other countries, including potentially seeking accession to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. At the same time as looking for new opportunities, we are also seeking to achieve continuity in our trade and investment relationships with third countries, including those covered by existing EU free trade agreements and other EU preferential arrangements. This will be a technical process rather than a renegotiation of existing terms. We are exploring with our trading partners ways to achieve this. It's important to remember that Scotland's largest market is the UK single market, and that Scotland trades nearly 4 times as much with the rest of the UK as it does with the EU, according to the Scottish Government's own figures. In addition to this, Scotland's trade with the rest of the world is higher than with the EU. There's a real opportunity to grow trade with the rest of the world as we leave the EU. There's no reason why trade with the rest of the world shouldn't rise when we start to sign independent trade deals which will enable the UK to trade more easily with the likes of Australia, Canada, the USA and CPTPP. After all, the USA is Scotland's largest international trading partner, worth over $4.8 billion in 2016. On the subject of inward investment, it's key to note that even since the Brexit vote, Scotland has still enjoyed success in attracting inward investment. An Ernst & Young report came out earlier this year highlighting that job growth from inward investment projects increased by 104% in 2017 compared to 2016. The Trade Bill is currently awaiting a date for its committee stage in the House of Lords. The bill provides for establishment of a UK trade remedies mechanism to ensure that we are able to continue to defend UK businesses from unfair trading practices. The Trade Bill also makes provision for the UK's accession to the Government Procurement Agreement at the World Trade Organisation. The UK Government is dedicated to delivering for the whole of the UK, and I am dedicated to ensuring that Scotland is heard, whether it be through my role representing Scotland's interests directly in the Cabinet or via the Scottish Government. It is also vital that Scottish businesses are fully engaged, for example via consultations on future trade agreements. A 14-week consultation period on FTAs has recently closed. During this period, there have been webinars, roundtables and meetings with business, as well as ministerial engagement with devolved administrations led by Minister Hollingbury. This is a clear demonstration of the UK Government's desire to take into account views from across the UK on our future trading arrangements, and we're committed to this continuing. The Department for International Trade supports trade and investment in all parts of the UK, such as through their overseas work, international events programme and online services. They work closely with their counterparts in the devolved administrations to cooperate effectively on events and to improve the navigation of support available to businesses. The Department values the work undertaken by devolved administrations, which contributes to an excellent overall offer of export and investment support available to businesses here in the UK. Any future trade deals must work for both the whole of the UK and reflect the needs of Scotland, as well as England, Wales and Northern Ireland. The Department of International Trade is working closely with devolved governments to deliver an approach that does work for the whole of the UK, reflecting the needs and individual strengths of each of the nations and drawing on their knowledge and expertise.
Grateful. Mr Hollingbury, have you got anything to add?
Well, I have quite a lot.
Very comprehensive.
I have quite a lot to add, Mr Sharp, but I thought that in the interest of times in your inquiry, I would not do so.
Grateful for that. We're not anticipating a vote until about 3:30, 4 o'clock at the earliest. We're hoping to conclude the session about 3:30 to allow members to get in position for any particular vote. So if we look at that as time for rounding up, we'll see if we can meet that. Maybe just to get things started, Mr Hollingbury, I would suggest that we looked at the trade white paper that the government published in 2017, and it stated that any future trade policy would be developed in collaboration with the devolved administrations, recognise their own particular interests and issues when it comes to international trade. Could you maybe explain to us how far you've got with this and what your thinking is just now and currently?
Absolutely, sir. You'll excuse the voice, I'm afraid I've lost it slightly. We do engage widely with the devolved administrations. We have monthly policy roundtables with policy groups amongst officials in the DAs. There are 6 weekly senior official group meetings to talk about those issues of more pertinence and highest interest. As we know, there's been quadrilateral discussions around the formal arrangements, and I'll return to that in a moment. Since July 2016, 25 ministerial visits to the DAs have taken place, including 12 to Scotland. And there have been plenty of ministerial bilaterals with between DIT ministers and responsible members at the devolved administrations. I have met twice with Ivan McKee, and I've also met with Derek Mackay, if perhaps you could advise her. And I have met with Ken Skates from the Welsh administration, and will do so very shortly again. When I met with Mr Mackay in Scotland last time, I undertook and promised him that I would attempt to bring the administrations closer in this regard, and we would talk more, we would simply have more interactions, and I now have set up a regular 6 weekly phone call with the ministers. It doesn't happen every single 6 weeks. It's entirely in the hands of the DAs as to whether they want to take advantage of that, and actually I shall be calling Mr Skates literally straight after this meeting. So that leaves, I think, a little more detail on the Concordat that we are attempting to reach. At this stage, I'm not in a position to be able to give you any particular details, but we hope to be able to share our proposals on this with the devolved administrations very shortly, and I do hope that will be this week.
Can you just help the committee just roughly what the themes are around that?
The themes are, I think you will have seen, the committee has seen, I know, the proposals from the Scottish Government on how they wish to be involved in free trade agreements. I think it's not unfair to say that 1 or 2 of those were at the far end of the bargaining scale, in that they said that there were several issues upon which they wished to be able to grant consent to the UK attitude to the free trade agreement. That is not on the table and will never be on the table. The UK is tasked with looking after UK free trade agreements abroad, and we will continue to do that. What is absolutely clear to me is that at every stage, and as deeply as possible, we should be taking the particular attitudes, the particular needs, the particular information from devolved administrations into account. We should be drawing them as closely in as is reasonable to the actual negotiations themselves, such that we have a full and frank exchange of views so that we know what the DAs want. If we work together more closely, we will, all of us, have a better agreement to work with. There will be less tension between the two, in fact, hopefully no tension between the two sides. The UK will be negotiating on behalf of everybody in full cognizance of the facts and what the devolved administrations need and want from a free trade agreement. And I am confident that what we will be offering is very much in that spirit of the commitment I made in Scotland back in September.
We heard from the Scottish Minister responsible for trade in the Scottish Parliament, and he was saying to this committee that what he desired probably more than anything else was to be involved in the conversations and discussions about trade arrangements at a very early stage. I just wonder what your views on that would be and how you would see a role for Scottish ministers being involved at the preliminary discussions about trade arrangements.
I think I'm not going to pick out any particular stage of the agreements. I'm absolutely convinced that what he says, in essence, is correct. The more closely we interact with the devolved administrations, the more closely we draw people in, the more information we exchange, the more frank that information can be, the better it will be for all of us. And I believe that the proposals we are going to make very shortly are absolutely in line with delivering that commitment.
And as a Minister responsible for this, you're obviously aware of the different trading priorities that Scotland has. There's been lots of discussion featured round about the fishing industry, for example, and the way that Scotland, with food and drink particularly, exports to the rest of the world. How could they be featured into any arrangement that you would have as in your negotiations with third parties?
Very straightforwardly, exactly as you would imagine. When we are aware of exactly what the issues are, exactly what protections may or may not be needed, exactly what market opportunities those businesses wish, and in the end it is businesses we're talking about here, then the negotiating mandate will be shaped around those offensive and defensive interests. And certainly not terms that I care for much, they're far too aggressive as far as I'm concerned, but we can see that nations have desires and wants, and they want to protect certain things, and it's reasonable that both sides should be able to do that. These conversations with businesses primarily, but with the devolved administrations to point us towards areas we may not have seen or may have forgotten, or hidden areas that are not yet apparent to us, will help us shape those defensive and offensive interests more precisely. Whether we'll be able to deliver on all of them is, of course, a moot point. That is for negotiation, but it is absolutely right that the DAs should be in a position to shape the negotiations before we start.
We'll come into some more detail just about some of the issues that we've heard as a committee about proposals and plans for the type of things that you mentioned. But I'd just be keen to hear from the Secretary of State about how he sees the arrangements for Scottish ministers and Scottish Parliament involved in future trade arrangements.
Well, the first thing, Mr Wishart, and I'm happy to put it on the record, is I very much welcomed Mr McKee's appointment. I felt that it was an appropriate ministry to have within the Scottish Government, because previously, prior to the changes, trade was in with a whole range of other things, and to have a dedicated minister, I think, has already made a real difference in the dialogue that we are able to have directly with the Scottish Government. Obviously, in addition to Mr Hollenbury, I've met Mr McKee, I've met with Mr Mackay, and indeed a number of the officials that have been appointed. So I think that we're in a much better place now to be able to dovetail, have the discussions and dialogue. I think it is very important that we, to maximise the benefit for Scotland, that we're all aligned, that we're aligned with the Minister, we're aligned working closely, as I'm sure we'll come on to, with Scottish Development International, the role indeed of Scottish Enterprise as well to an extent. So I think the new structure provides a positive way forward, and from where I sit, Mr Hollenbury in particular, has embraced that.
I'm grateful for that. I'm going to allow Ms Hare to ask a question because I know she has to leave us for temporarily 20 past. So, Kirsten, if you want to ask your question, we'll come back to you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you both for joining us today. Minister Hollenbury, how effective do you feel the Great Campaign has been across Scotland? It's obviously the brand promotion that has been put out by the Department. Well,
I think in the end, the only people who will reflect that to you properly are the businesses who have used it and been part of it. And the major clients with whom I have spent most times, the Scotch Whisky Associations, will not surprise you. Almost every market I go to, the Scotch Whisky Association and or Diageo and others has things to say. The reflections that I have had is that it works well out there. It is, of course, a UK-wide product, over or underlaid, perhaps we should say, by Scottish Development International, but which we find an extremely useful adjunct to what we do, where there are Scottish interests, where there are Scottish members of staff in post in various regions. They are most often co-locate with our staff out in region. In fact, the only time when they don't co-locate is when there is a physical barrier to them doing so. It is much better for us to have STI co-located with us, and our teams get on extremely well, and clearly where there is a Scottish interest, it is highlighted by STI, but I think members should be confident that the GREAT campaign is available to all, is used by Scottish businesses to a great extent, and most of the reporting which I hear, in fact all the reporting I have ever heard, is it is a method of promotion which companies find extremely useful, Scottish or otherwise.
And do you believe, kind of on that point, that both having like the Scottish and UK branding available to them as an asset or a drawback for Scottish exporters?
Well, I think in the end, only the Scottish businesses will really be able to make their own mind up about that. There is a very wide understanding internationally of the GREAT campaign. That is a branding that has been used for a number of years now. I have seen it in pretty much every place I have been across the world, and I've now travelled to 14 nations since I was appointed. And in every case, from Qatar to Kazakhstan to Taiwan, Panama and Costa Rica and beyond, this is a brand that is understood by local businesses. So I don't detract for a moment from SDI's branding. I believe that it can be a useful adjunct too, but I think if I was, as a Scottish business, looking to promote myself internationally, I would certainly want to write off the idea of using GREAT for good, rational, sensible reasons before I consider going elsewhere. If you are going to use the two brands concurrently, then it seems to me that makes some considerable sense. And it is entirely up to the Scottish Government, indeed, and of course to local Scottish companies to decide what they will do on that. But I think my simple observation is that this is a well-understood brand that brings value to the nation overseas and is a clear focus for British business when foreign companies wish to interact with us.
Thank you. Secretary of State, in the previous session, we, as has already been mentioned, we welcomed Ivan McKee, the Minister for Trade, Investment and Innovation, on behalf of the Scottish Government. And although the Minister did confirm that obviously 60% of Scottish exports are to the rest of the United Kingdom, 4 times that of the exports from Scotland to the EU, he did then go on to say that there's a desire on our part over time to change that because it is not a healthy situation for one country to be so dependent on another for such a high percentage of their exports. Why do you believe the Scottish Government have that opinion?
I think it is very important to acknowledge the importance of the market within the rest of the UK for Scotland. It is a very, very significant market, and it should not be forgotten or neglected. And I think that's very much a message from Scottish business. I met with Scottish financial businesses yesterday, and they were very clear. Obviously, issues that they have with the European Union, but for many of those businesses, the rest of the United Kingdom is clearly the most important marketplace. But I'm not saying that. And wanting to make sure that it's fully acknowledged, because these figures, which sometimes get pushed back, which I mentioned in my opening remarks, are Scottish Government figures, so not in terms of the importance of the rest of the UK. But I do think it is also important that Scotland and the UK as a whole looks firstly to ensuring, as we wish to maintain markets in Europe, but also beyond. And I think the view of DIT is that in terms of trade growth overall, 90% is going to come from the rest of the world in the next 15 years. And I think within Scotland, within the UK, we also have to be outward looking, but we can't and mustn't neglect the fact of the importance of the UK market to Scotland.
And just one final question. Secretary of State, you've proactively embarked on a number of trade missions in a global capacity. I just wondered how effective they have been to promote Scottish produce.
Well, the first point that I would say in relation to that is that in relation to those visits, we work very closely with Scottish Development International, for example, on my visit to Japan, so that in fact, we were both governments were making the same case for the benefits of particularly inward investment into Scotland, and there have been, particularly from Japan, a number of very significant investments and a number that are currently possible to take forward. When I was in New Zealand recently. I think the mood there is very much of seeing an opportunity in the post-Brexit world. There's no doubt that there were very difficult times in New Zealand at the time the UK came into the EU, and there's a feeling that the strength and depth of relationships, trading relationships that previously exist, could be re-established, and there's a very positive attitude. And when most recently I've been in South America, I've been very pleased by the openness and to Scotland, the very positive links that already exist in many of these countries with Scotland, and I think there are, particularly in South America, there's huge opportunities for Scotland.
Thank you. Thank you,
Chair. Secretary of State, a recent answer I received from yourself to a written parliamentary question stated that respective Secretaries of State for Scotland have made 11 international visits to promote Scotland's businesses and exporters to overseas stakeholders. Can I ask what measurable benefits did Scotland get from those trips? And can you tell us what countries you visited? And could you tell us how much that all cost?
Well, I think I have answered questions or provided freedom of information request information in relation to all the costs, but I certainly can provide you that by letter, because we make subsequently, because we make all that information publicly available. In the course of this year, I visited Hong Kong and China. In Hong Kong, as you'll be aware, there are very significant Scottish financial services interests and a Scottish diaspora there. So we had significant engagement with them, and particularly highlighting opportunities that there might be for investment by them, both in the UK and in Scotland. I then travelled to Japan, where we were involved in a major promotion of Scottish food and drink. I met with Canon Medical, who invest heavily in Scotland and who we were encouraging to take part in tender projects for the Queen Elizabeth Hospital.
That's one. Thank you for those details. But I just wonder if you can tell us how you're going to measure, how the UK Government and Scotland Office is going to measure the benefits that those trips might be able to demonstrate to the people of Scotland that they're worthwhile, the cost is worthwhile.
Well, I think all trips have to be measured in two regards. Sometimes there are specifics where we have taken forward a specific initiative, such as with the higher education sector. Sometimes we are promoting Scotland, very much making the case that Scotland's open for business, or available for business. And I see today Mr McKee, for example, is in Germany with very much that message. Here's what Scotland's got.
Is the UK Government and Scotland Office reviewing these trips? Will be sharing with us what specific outcomes have come from these various trips?
Yes, because I think it is. I think it is important to do that. But we are at a point, I think, that you would expect me to say that we're this change as we leave the EU, where there is a considerable amount of just getting out there and telling people that that we're here, we're open for business, the opportunities that exist, and that has been a big part of what we've been doing in recent times.
Thank you.
I think, did you have something specific?
Just very briefly, Mr. Chairman. I mentioned I've done 14 trips abroad. And I would just say this about trips. Sometimes things are entirely measurable. But sometimes it is difficult to exactly quantify what a trip will bring. In my case, as a junior minister, I'm usually an articulation point around which an agreement is reached. And they may be fairly low-level agreements. They may be about the potential to explore changes in the legal process or in contract law that might then allow British companies to have access. In some cases, it's much more acute. So in a couple of my trips, it's been specifically about transitioning free trade agreements, which in some cases are worth many tens of billions of pounds. But I think to try and put an absolute monetary return on each and every, frankly, diplomatic trip, which is quite often the case that one engages into, is a very, very serious ask that I think could cost an awful lot of money to do and actually yield not terribly much information that was worth having. So I think it's very important that we monitor how much we spend. It's very important that departments spend taxpayers' money wisely, but I'm not entirely convinced that a monetary outcome can be the only reasonable outcome of that review. There are many reasons why government ministers will travel overseas. Quite a lot of them will not necessarily lead to immediate monetary gains, but might be enormously to the benefit of the country.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Chair. Secretary of State. Unfortunately, Ms Brock has asked almost exactly the question which I was about to ask. However, it does open another issue, the question of monetary return and cost. Presumably in all of these trade missions, indeed whether the Secretary of State is part of them or not, the interests of the Scottish businesses, the Scottish business sector and all sectors of the Scottish economy will be represented by the UK Government. What would be the cost to the taxpayer of doubling that up and sending both a UK Government delegation and, say, sometime later that year a Scottish Government one?
I would certainly very much welcome an approach where we could move to more joint delegations. I think that would be a much better way to get the best value for taxpayers in Scotland, and I think that would be an aspiration. When I recently went to South America, I did discuss it ahead of going with Mr Mackay. I mean, it was very short, and explained what I was doing, and opened up the opportunities for Scottish enterprise in particular, but Scottish Development International, to contribute to what might be involved in the programme, fed back, for example, after one of the visits, fed back very much from South America, very much directly to John Swinney and the Scottish Government, the wish for higher and University of Scotland, the wish for higher education to become more involved in South America. I think it's a huge opportunity for Scottish higher education, as they've done in other parts of the world, to get much more involved in South America. So there's a feeding back, but I am very open and would be very conducive to even closer working together.
And do you think that there is the possibility of that and the benefit to be gained?
I think there is a possibility. As I've said in my open answer to Mr Wish's question, I mean, I very much welcome Mr McKee's appointment. I think it's a very the appointment itself is very good, and Mr McKee is a very sound individual as well. You probably won't thank me for saying that, but I think that I think there is continued scope for closer working, and I'm sure that that's what businesses and industry bodies want. In fact, I think a lot of feedback I get, because we all know Scotland is a bit politicised, let's be frank, that businesses and organisations, they don't want to be put in a position to choose.
No.
They don't want to be said, well, if I back this Scottish Government initiative, I can't back a UK Government initiative. They actually want to be able to work with both governments, and I think our objective is to facilitate that.
Moving forward, for both Secretary of State and the Minister, how would the UK Government engage, and how is it currently engaging with the Scottish Government about post-Brexit trade policy? Would you be, for example, hoping to take this more joint approach, or do you think there'll be a more separate?
Are we talking about trade policy or trade promotion?
Trade policy.
I think, Mr Wishart, that I've largely covered that, because in the end that is really about our future trade arrangements, and I think we will know more, or rather the Scottish Government will know more, and therefore the committee will know more in the next week or so. Thereafter, it's about the institutions that we have set up or need to set up to operate an independent trade policy, and that of course includes the Trade Remedies Authority, it includes the powers given under Clause 2 of the Trade Bill, which allows to transition existing agreements, our accession to the General Procurement Agreement, our accession to the World Trade Organization, and so on and so forth. And there are not many regards in which devolved institutions and authorities and administrations would get involved in those. There will certainly be a place for devolved administrations to contribute to the Trade Remedies Authority and their deliberations and what cases are brought forward. As yet unset, absolutely, in terms of how that will actually interact, but there is certainly a role to be played there. But I think in those other areas, those are largely without consideration of devolved issues. Now, clearly, there's a lot around Clause 2, but I've given evidence on that to the Scottish Parliament and about the Section 12 and the concurrent powers and so on and so forth. But I think that's more about domestic legislation rather than wider trade policy post-exit. Hopefully that's covered most of it.
That's fair enough. And just finally, the Secretary of State, as Scotland's senior representative in the UK government, how will you judge, or do you think there is an ideal way to judge whether or not the approach is successful for Scottish trade and industry?
Well, I think together, both governments together have to just look at the numbers. The relative percentage of exports from Scotland is below that of the UK. Both governments are engaged in significant initiatives at the moment. If those initiatives don't lead to an increase in those numbers, then of course we have to look at that, and I think we have to look at it. We have to look at it together. There are a range of views. I mean, one of the main views, which I think both governments share, for example, is that far too few SMEs in Scotland export, and that's been an ongoing issue. You'll recall when you were perhaps on the other side of the fence, if I might put it that way. The then Secretary of State, Michael Moore, put a really big effort into, with the assistance of Brian Wilson, in getting a report about how we could get SMEs exporting more. So I think we both recognise that issue, for example, and we both need to facilitate that moving forward. But I think we should, I think we should be called to account. If export numbers from Scotland don't increase, then both governments need to be called to account as to why is that the case.
Thank you.
And likewise, the rest of the UK. This is not unique to Scotland.
No.
Well, I think the problem is more acute in Scotland. I met with the SFB Scotland to discuss this. Across the UK, far too few small businesses do export. There is a lot of work going on in that area about having a digital hub where people can find UK export opportunities. Some 24,000 opportunities are now on that hub for people to look at. And we are trying to get to a position where it's much, much easier for small businesses to interact with exporting opportunities, because at the moment they just don't play as well as they should.
Thank you.
To ask you, Minister, just about what your comment around the involvement of devolved administrations in trade negotiations. Now, you stated fairly emphatically that consent will never be on the table in regard to those discussions. I wondered why the UK government is so emphatically against that. Dr. Kirsty Hughes at our October evidence session said, I think we do not have to be quite so scared of this idea of requiring consent and not just consultation. I certainly think it would be worth looking further at these different models. It may have raised a lot of eyebrows when the Walloon Parliament held up the Canadian trade deal, but in the end, CETA went through. Can you explain to us the UK government's position on this?
I can. Straightforwardly, it is not a devolved competence for the Scottish administration. That is as set out in the original documentation and legislation, and secondly, that is for a very good reason, which is about the protection of the single market in the UK. If we have managed to negotiate a free trade arrangement with a third party, they have every right to expect that it will be delivered as it has been negotiated for the whole of the UK, and that is to protect the single market. Now, there are areas of devolved competence where I believe it is absolutely right that the devolved administrations should have very clear routes into the negotiating team and into the formation of the mandate that it eventually comes forward and feeds into it. And I have every confidence that the arrangements which we're going to suggest, hopefully this week, will demonstrate that we mean what we say. But at the moment, the UK government is absolutely clear, and I will have no more to say on this, that as far as the UK trade policy and the negotiation of it overseas with third parties will remain a UK position.
Could I just ask before
Yeah.
you're going to announce something this week? Could you tell us?
Say again, sorry.
You said you were going to announce something this week.
Well, we will be sharing with the administrations our initial proposals on the Concordat.
Thank you.
I just think it's interesting that Canadian government can clearly come to a mature understanding with its provinces and territories, and yet the UK government refuses to countenance any look at this.
Well, that of course
as
is
an option
a
at
federal
all.
system, which the UK
Yes,
is
of
not.
course, but it was impressed upon us that they discuss these things and arrive at a conclusion rather than override and impose the views of the central government on those territories and provinces.
As I've just explained, that I hope that the proposals we will make this week will show that we take a similar attitude with a different route, that we will be absolutely clear in our intention, we are absolutely clear in our intention to listen to the devolved administrations and to make sure that the opinions of the Scottish people and their businesses are taken into account when we form trade policy and negotiate our deals overseas.
Well, indeed, in an ideal world. Although, of course, recently we had an
not
article in
world.
the Times about the EFRA Secretary of State, who said that Britain will lead an agricultural revolution with the use of gene editing, despite concerns about genetically modified food. I'm quoting from the Times article there. Now, that won't be very welcome news to many people in Scotland. As you'll be aware, Secretary of State, this is very much a live issue up there. Can you tell us how you'd envisage that particular discussion being handled in intergovernmental discussions around that particular
Well,
issue?
to be clear, in terms of negotiating free trade agreements, my department has nothing to do with how DEFRA sets the regulations on food and what they can and cannot do. Our job is to go out and create new free trade agreements. In that our position on this will have reduced products potentially at our end, which have a certain character, shall we say, that may well be of importance in future negotiations. But it is for DEFRA, indeed with collective government agreement, of course, to move its policy forward.
The Secretary of State?
Well, within the devolved responsibilities, there'll be nothing that DEFRA is doing or would do that would override or change existing responsibilities, and the Scottish Parliament has certainly, even when I was a member of it, debated and discussed issues around genetically modified food. So DEFRA won't be imposing requirements on Scotland that are within the responsibilities of the Scottish Parliament.
So you can guarantee that even if a trade deal depended on the UK accepting GM food,
well, firstly, I think one of the
that
most
there's no danger of that ever being imposed on Scotland.
One of the most important things, and it is something to make sure that everybody fully understands, is that when there are new trade deals, new trade agreements, they will have to be agreed by this Parliament, with 59 MPs from Scotland, making sure that Scotland's views and interests are fully reflected, as well as people from across the whole of the United Kingdom. And that's why I'm absolutely clear that many of these stories that circulate about chlorine-washed chicken and other such foodstuffs, are entirely fanciful. I cannot see this Parliament agreeing chlorine-washed chicken coming into Scotland or the United Kingdom.
Can I say, Mr. York, my Secretary of State has made it absolutely plain, time and again, that we will not be lowering our standards. It is as simple as that. And can I give
our
you
standards, no.
Can I give you our standards include those which will be applied to imports. Plainly, if it is not something that can be brought to market in the UK, there is not a great deal of point in importing it in the first place if it cannot be consumed. So, just for the sake of argument, but let's just put it this way. it would be commercial madness for us to drop those standards. So let's put aside all potential political implications, political motives and so on. The brand for the UK overseas is about quality. It is absolutely about top-level quality, whether it's advice you're given on how to build an airport, whether it's how you deal with the mining of minerals or what design you put in to extract oil from the sea, and indeed, very particularly in many markets, about the quality of the products which you are consuming. And I'm talking here about clothes, and I'm talking about food, and I'm talking about drink. There are many markets in the world where food and drink cannot be trusted to be what it says on the can. So just looking particularly at food and drink, we would be very foolish commercially, internationally, to lower our standards. It would do us untold damage.
And yet we have your former ambassador to the United States between 2012 and 2016, Sir Peter Westmacott, warning that the Trump administration was playing hardball and would likely demand that the UK allowed the import of products such as hormone-treated US beef and chlorine-washed chickens. Do you completely discount his opinion?
No, absolutely
given his
don't.
experience in the US?
People demand all sorts of things in free trade agreements when they start, and the results turn out to be otherwise. And the reason they turn out to be otherwise is because the country on the other side simply will not allow it. An accommodation was reached on this, at least in TTIP, and I have absolutely no doubt that we will be able to reach an accommodation too.
I think this is very reassuring, because I think there's lots of concerns that have been raised just about some of the issues around standards. And so would you be prepared even to go as far as to say that if a free trade arrangement was offered by the United States that looked favourable on a whole range of issues, that would be rejected in order to maintain the very high standards we have around food?
All I can say is repeat what the Secretary of State has said, and which I've repeated here today already, is we will not be lowering our standards. And my opinion, on top of that, is that commercially, internationally, it would be a very, very ill-thought-through thing to do.
Okay. And just to restate what I said, Mr. Wishart, that agreement, even if the government was minded to enter into some agreement, would have to be agreed by Parliament. And I cannot see this Parliament, whatever its composition, agreeing to the sort of measures that Ms Brock has set out.
Great. Well, that is comforting and concerned for the whole committee. Tommy Shepherd.
Good afternoon. I'm pleased, I guess, to say that you seem to be exhibiting a generally positive attitude towards the need for discussion and involvement of the Scottish Government in trade affairs. I'd like to press a little more on what potential mechanisms there might be to allow that to happen. The Institute for Government, for example, has suggested that within the auspices of the JMC there might be a subcommittee dedicated to trade. Is that something that you think has got legs?
I think that it's that, as you're aware, that there is a sort of review of intergovernmental relations at this moment ongoing, which I think is going to report back to the next plenary session of the Joint Ministerial Committee. But I think there are, there's certainly a case to be made for that type of arrangement.
Well, if not that, can you see any alternative structural models that might allow the regular interface between the two governments?
Well, I think Mr. Holmgren's already set out the way in which we're going to respond to proposals the Scottish Government made, and a way in which to certainly bring together officials, the regular dialogue that there is between ministers, both within the Department of International Trade and indeed myself directly with Derek Mackay and now Ivan McKee. But I think there is it's certainly worth considering whether within the context of the JMC there is an approach that could help there.
So are you open to the idea of putting these ongoing discussions onto a more structured and formal placement?
Well, I'm open to the idea of, and very much support, the review of intergovernmental relations, and I think that needs to be seen in the context of it. So I think in summary, what I'm saying is it is worth considering. I'm not expressing a view one way or the other, but I'm not dismissing it.
Okay. And when it comes to discussing future trade deals, do you see a a role for the Scottish Government to be participating in the development of those deals?
Sorry, Mr. Wishart, I would just refer the Honourable Gentleman back to the comments I made earlier about the Concordat. That Concordat is going to be proposing exactly what he's looking for, which is to incorporate the Scottish Government and its officials into the way which we approach new free trade deals. And I ask him to exercise a little bit of patience. Those will be shared with the Government very, very shortly, and they come as a package which also addresses the previous point that he made. I'm not in a position to be able to say anything more specific than that today, save that I am content that what we are offering is, I think, a solution that will bring all of the inputs that we need to do good trade deals in from the devolved administrations, not just in Scotland, but in Northern Ireland, if and when it exists, and in Wales too, such that those who are participating feel like they have been listened to, that their points have been taken, that they have been worked into the proposals that we are making, and that there are ways of dealing with that and auditing it regularly.
Well, I mean, I look forward to seeing that, but since we're here, I mean, the question really is, do you think the Scottish Government or its representatives will be in the room or waiting at the door outside?
Are we talking about during the negotiations?
Yes.
Are we talking about the formation?
During the negotiations.
I think it is simply worthwhile leaving this with officials just for now. I do believe the Honourable Gentleman, Mr. Shepherd, will be. One can never predict in any of these things, particularly in the Scottish context. But I believe the offer we're making is a full and fair one, and that will satisfy any reasonable observer that the devolved authorities are having a full part in the process of not only creating the outlines of our free trade agreements, but also having a role further down the line as well.
Okay, well, my final question might be hypothetical then, but
keep trying.
It is. What do you see as the role of Scottish Government representatives in this process of FTA negotiations?
Ensuring that Scottish people's and Scottish businesses' views are heard and taken into account, and form part of the process by which we form the mandates for negotiating new trade agreements. Now, that doesn't mean they will be involved in the absolute process of the writing of the mandates, but absolutely part of the process which shapes the input into those mandates and ensures that the devolved administration's, devolved government's views are known, taken into account, and end up being satisfied by what is being negotiated.
Well, I think we're all very much looking with great excitement to
so am I.
this week.
I'm very, very excited.
Maybe if it helps, we did meet with the Canadians and we were very, very impressed with their level of involvement within the whole CETA process particularly. And I noted your remarks that, we're not federal in the UK, and don't we know that? But one of the things that we were almost promised in 2014 is that this nation would be as close to federalism as it was humanly possible as part of the process of the independence referendum. So we're looking forward to that. But one of the features about the Canadian model, I think, was that impressed certainly certain members of the committee was the fact that they were present during these negotiations and were able to make an input either through conversations or discussions, or were able to put the point of view. I know you're probably not going to tell me, and you'll have to wait till Thursday, but is that a feature of the Canadian model that particularly impressed you?
All I can say about the Canadian model, Mr. Wishart, is that my understanding from those who are close to trade negotiations and know their stuff tell me that it is something the Canadians actually, in the next iteration, say they are unlikely to reproduce.
Okay, we'll leave it at that for now. We'll move on to Mr. Ross Thompson.
Thank you very much, Chair. What are your views on the Scottish Government's proposal that the UK Government should be obliged to seek their agreement on areas of devolved competence?
Can we just be a little more precise about where we're talking about?
So, in relation to any future trade agreement, on the basis that it could impact on areas of devolved responsibility or competence?
I think it is absolutely right that in areas of devolved competence, I think as was envisaged in the original memorandum back in 2012, though plainly that wasn't written with free trade agreements in mind, and there are different dynamics around free trade agreements, that particular attention needs to be paid by the UK government to what the devolved administrations have to say about areas that are in their devolved competence. Plainly, it would not be right that anything else should be considered there. There has to be due consideration given to that area.
And if we were to go with the Scottish Government view that we'd be obliged to seek their consent or agreement, in effect that could give the Scottish Government a veto on trade deals and on UK trade policy, could that make it slower for the UK to strike trade deals in future if we were to go along?
Well, I think I can go a little further than that. As I've already said, it is not, I think, right that however close we want to bring the devolved administrations to take their advice and for them to represent the interests of their particular areas and responsibilities, it would not be right to allow the devolved administrations to have an effective veto at any stage. This is a UK competence, it will remain a UK competence, and no, it is not in our plans to allow the administrations to have that effective right.
And on that, Secretary of State, as you know, Scotland has 59 MPs. Some of them sit round the cabinet table. Do you believe that it is important that, therefore, the principle that foreign affairs, international treaties, international trade remains fundamentally a reserved matter, and that's what people voted for back in 2014?
Well, firstly, because it was referenced earlier, just to be clear for the record, I don't believe the Wallonian example in relation to the CETA trade arrangement was a good one, and I don't think that is a model that would be one to follow here within the United Kingdom. What I've said in my earlier evidence is all of the United Kingdom's MPs, including 59 from Scotland, will have the opportunity to contribute to the debates and agreements on future trade agreements. And that's why I'm very confident that many of the things which are off the spectres, which are produced off chlorine-washed chicken and hormone-injected beef will not make it to the shelves of Scotland or anywhere else in the United Kingdom, because it's not possible to get the agreement of Parliament. And one of the approaches, which I think is a very welcome one, is the consultation which the government through the Department have already engaged in relation to future agreements. In terms, in terms of building the parameters, the mandate, understanding what's acceptable, because you can't go in. I think this is one of the problems. Looking back in relation to the TTIP proposals, negotiators went forward without understanding really what their mandate was. In fact, both in Europe and the US, and ended up with a situation where it wasn't acceptable on either side. So we don't want to. I think there are things to learn there. We go forward with a mandate which we know it can be accepted throughout the United Kingdom and in Parliament, and achieve a deal that we can get agreement on within Parliament.
If I could just add, if I may, Mr. Wishart, the consultations, as I'm sure members will probably know, ran for 14 weeks. They garnered a huge number of responses, even if one strips out postcard campaigns and so on and so forth. In relative terms, there were enormous numbers of contributions, far more than is traditional in EU consultations. So lots of people have had their say, and of course the Scottish Government has also had its say. It is quite right and proper. And I think I can reflect at this stage, even though we are still quite early days of analysing those responses, when I flick through the Scottish Government's contribution, I would say that on the vast majority of issues we are aligned. There is no disagreement about what it is we are trying to achieve. Now, clearly, there are one or two areas, and those will be dealt with through all the channels I've already outlined, in official level meetings and ministerial meetings and so on and so forth, and we will get to a place. But I suspect we will find in the end that there is not a great deal upon which we disagree.
Prolonged conversation about what we'll be debating for the next 5 days in terms of the political declaration and the deal that's been offered to Parliament. But could you just tell us roughly where we are in terms of your thinking about customs arrangements, for example? Because I know that in the political declarations, it's the UK government's is looking to seek to build and improve on the single customs territory provided in the withdrawal agreement. Is that still the intention of this government? Is it your intention to seek a customs arrangement with the rest of the EU, and how, not taking up a vast amount of times, would you see that working?
My view is that the political declaration and the withdrawal agreement are set out, and you've all read them, I suspect, or if you, at least you haven't, you've read some summaries of them, and I think you'll be very familiar with what is and is not possible, might or might not be possible in certain different arrangements. The political declaration is exactly what it is. It is an aspiration about what we wish to agree with the European Union, agreed with the European Union as a framework within which to operate. And I think we all know what the potential outcomes are of that and their implications for trade.
And how do you see the UK, therefore, within that arrangement, being able to negotiate its own trade deals and arrangements?
I think we, out with the backstop, let's just call it's all about...
Well, we'll leave the backstop over just
fine. If we can just push that to one side, because I think we know that complicates matters, unquestionably. But we are absolutely confident, and it is contained in both the withdrawal agreement and in the political declaration, that we should be free to negotiate our own free trade agreements and indeed conduct our own independent trade policy, and that we will do so. Do I think we will be able to do so easily? That will depend on the amount with which we align with European regulation. Plainly, that has an effect. But that, I think, is probably, for anybody who's concerned about leaving the European Union and establishing sovereignty, a sensible, grown-up use of the trading of sovereignty for one purpose against another. And we will find at certain stages that certain things are more important to us in certain markets. That might mean we want to align less with the EU. But in the end, that agreement is one free trade agreement, and there are others out there, and we will decide where to align.
Yeah, on the EU, other trade arrangements, I think the understanding of everybody is that you're able to negotiate and discuss future trade arrangements with third-party countries, but unable to sign them until transition is concluded. Is my understanding right?
They are not able to be used.
Not able to be used.
Yeah.
And therefore, in that period and process, during the transition arrangement, will you still be looking to seek the participation, involvement and conversations with Scottish ministers and Scottish Government?
The same rules. So on the new free trade agreements, the same rules will apply exactly as I have described I haven't described it, but in the Concordat. Those rules which the government will see tomorrow, the Scottish Government should see tomorrow or the next day, hopefully, will outline exactly how free trade agreements are to be handled, and I would expect these to be handled no differently because they are in the implementation period or because we are a standalone nation.
Grateful. Danielle Rowley.
I think Ms Brock probably covered my question quite thoroughly, so I'm happy to skip on. I know we're tight for time.
Well, that therefore leaves us with Jed Killen.
Thank you, Chair. The Government has said it wants to use Brexit as an opportunity to push for more liberalisation in the global trade of services. How do you aim to achieve this, given the reluctance of many countries to liberalise trade in services?
Given the
reluctance of many countries to liberalise?
Well, I mean, services are a very interesting case in point. We actually, I think, deposited our services schedules at the WTO, I think, yesterday or the day before. So we've taken a step forwards there. So we have a WTO presence on that, and we're now in a position where other governments can comment on those schedules. Yes, services are a tough nut to crack. They're a particularly tough nut to crack because the UK is a very wide open services nation in the first place. There is a great deal you can do here already. So what we have to trade on actual service access is perhaps less than it may be for many other countries. In fact, an awful lot that can be done on services can be done through negotiations out with the free trade agreement about countries gradually reforming their system that has barriers to trade built in, quite often to services. And I'm thinking here about things like having domestic presence on your board or domestic level of shareholding. Or, for example, in Taiwan, where the administration had not quite got to grips with the fact that publishing documents in Chinese only for tenders was counterproductive, not because it locked out UK producers, but because they would then use a different set of translators who may well translate something in where dots and commas really can matter in a commercial transaction. So there had to be an official UK version, or rather I should say English version, of the documents. So services, yes, that they are notoriously difficult to negotiate. That does not mean that they cannot be. It does not mean that there cannot be a sea change, actually, in the way services are dealt with. And we've got all sorts of areas where there isn't really any established practice yet, particularly around data, where the WTO has not really kept up. TISA negotiations are stalled. There's also another way of looking at this, which is that yes, it's important to find even the smallest increase that can be had, for example, in legal services in each of the states in the United States to try and get a little bit of extra of a huge pie and therefore go that way. But it's also worth thinking about whether or not prospects for 10, 15, 20 years down the line, where middle classes are growing in a very populous country, where actually shaping services and shaping service regulation in those countries is another way of which you can increase service trade. So, yes, it's a complex area.
And the Government has previously proposed in the Chequers Agreement that it seeks looser regulatory relationship with EU for services. Is that still the case? And what evidence do you have that this divergence will benefit the UK?
Well, I hate to tell you, I hate to say this, I don't like to say I'm not entirely sure, but we have 2 trade departments in the UK government. One's negotiating the one with the EU, and we do the rest. So I've not been intimately involved with the proposals that we're making to the EU, but clearly I know, as everyone else does, that service agreements with the EU as part of the Future Economic Partnership are incredibly important to the UK. Over 70% of our exports are in services. That is less so in, we have, funnily enough, actually juxtaposed positions in our EU position as against the rest of the world. Our issues are with goods, services are lower than they should be. We have to try and increase our opportunities in services with the EU if we possibly can, and regulation is clearly an area you can look at.
You happy for me to move on, Chair? Yeah. Will the Government consider liberalising visa restrictions for skilled workers and students from non-EU countries to help sign new trade deals? Will they be jumping the queue, to use the Prime Minister's language?
I think the immigration white paper is coming forward shortly. I've not seen it any more than you have. But it is clear from the language that's being used that skills are going to be very, very important, and it is of course clear that in many free trade agreements that are struck, certainly those struck most recently by the EU with Japan and with Canada and so on, there are parts of that about mode 4, the various modes of service provision, mode 4 being the movement of persons between jurisdictions, which any rational country would look at as something which they would facilitate in a free trade agreement. It is part of service facilitation, and if you are able to get reciprocal gains, then it is something I think you rationally have to think of.
So how are you going to square all of this, given that one of the major concerns of Brexit seems to have been free movement of people, immigration? Given that any new trade deal is going to have an element of this within it, and the Government has a commitment to reduce net migration, how do you square all of that?
Well, there's a very, very real difference between a position where an individual, because of where they reside, are able to move with complete freedom to any other part of the same jurisdiction, whether it's the same country or a different country, reside, claim to use services, take benefits, do anything that they wish. Incidentally, I just, for the record, my analysis, for what it's worth, at the time of the referendum was that actually free movement probably was a net economic contributor to the country, but that's just me and what the conclusion I reached. That does not mean that the government is pro-free movement of people in the EU, because that is absolutely not the case. In future, and certainly in agreements on free trade, we would expect that the individuals whom we would facilitate would bring tangible and calculable net benefit. I'm not suggesting for a moment that you'd sit down with a pen and paper and work out what this person is going to bring, but it would be the intention of any arrangements that you reached that you would be facilitating both movements both ways, and that both those sets of movements would be of use to the company, to the countries involved, and of course it would be done by mutual agreement. So I don't think it's the same position at all. In essence, I suppose, the free movement of people was an absolutely extreme example of what a free trade agreement could produce in terms of movement of people.
But it's even worse for Scotland, isn't it? I'm sure the Secretary of State will be able to confirm this, that nearly all of our population growth in Scotland is predicated on inward migration. And we've heard from several sectors, not just this inquiry, but in others, particularly in agriculture and the service sector and social care, that the ending of freedom of movement could have quite a significant, if not disastrous, consequence on our economy. How do we get around some of these issues?
So I'm here to comment on trade policy, which I've been trying to do. I'll concentrate on free trade agreements. Plainly, we are looking to...
What's the Secretary of State been doing in Cabinet to try and help us with some of these issues?
We are, as Mr Hollenby said, we're about to bring forward an immigration white paper. I want to make sure that white paper reflects...
And have you stressed just how important immigration is for Scotland in that?
I've made absolutely clear the importance that immigration has played in relation to many parts of Scotland, and particularly remote and rural Scotland. The issues which I think you as your period as chairman covered on depopulation and demographic challenge, and these issues need to be reflected in our immigration system. So we're in a process where we're about to bring forward a white paper, and I'm looking forward to seeing those issues reflected in that white paper.
Are you confident then, when the white paper is produced, that you've been able to ensure that Scotland's particular and specific requirements are being met and have been acknowledged and recognised?
Well, we've had the debate and discussion before, of course, about these issues and whether they apply in other parts of the United Kingdom. And as you know, I don't.
You're the Secretary of State for Scotland.
Yes, but I'm also Secretary of State for Scotland on the basis that Scotland is part of the United Kingdom. Now, we don't agree on that, but that's the basis which I'm proceeding, which is that the United Kingdom, across the United Kingdom, there are areas which have demographic challenge, depopulation, challenge, specific needs in relation to businesses. And that's why I don't think there's a specific or devolved or Scotland-only immigration system is necessary. What we need to have, though, is a UK immigration system that meets Scotland's needs, and that's what that's what I look forward to seeing in the white paper.
Do you know what I've had real difficulty in securing, and maybe Mr Hollingbury could help me a bit more with this, is this idea that any freedom of movement works both ways, that there will be a restriction placed on UK nationals going to live and work in the European Union. Can you, as somebody who understood the economic consequences of immigration, can you just say that is going to be the case, that all the rights and freedoms that all of us had around this table will be denied the next generation of young people?
I can't say that at all.
You can't. So how not? If we restricted people up to £30,000 to come to the UK, is it conceivable that the EU won't do the same to people from the UK?
Well, I'm afraid to say I just sit inside the cover of my speciality here, which is that it is precisely the sorts of exceptions you're talking about that we will be negotiating in free trade arrangements. And we'll be doing it to the maximum possible advantage for the UK as a whole. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't be sending people overseas reciprocally to occupy similar posts, perhaps, or in similar arrangements in other companies. That way, in FTAs, both sides can benefit. There is plenty of evidence to suggest that, and I don't think countries would enter into those arrangements.
I'll keep on trying to get this from UK government ministers, that there will be a reciprocal arrangement which will obviously impact on the abilities of people from the UK to live and work in the EU. What they do, what we do to them, they'll do to us, and surely that must be acknowledged and accepted. What do you think, Secretary of State?
Well, I don't think an exact mirror of the arrangements that apply in the UK would necessarily apply in the EU or individual member states. It's already set out in the future partnership proposal that there will be the ability to work on a visa basis within the EU. The exact terms of that are not, are for ongoing discussion and negotiation. And I think I've said previously to this committee, for example, in relation to education and cultural opportunities, particularly for young people, we want to see those continuing as we leave the EU.
I've tried my best once again.
I just want to add one last thing. just from the department's point of view, I cannot see that the department would be likely to consider an arrangement that would be similar to free movement with any other trade partner. And I'm not particularly here, I'm not commenting about the EU. I'm simply saying, as we enter into negotiations with third-party countries, I think it is astonishingly unlikely that we would consider doing with any country out there the sort of an arrangement that looked like free movement did with the EU. I think that is very, very unlikely.
Yeah, free movement's gone, and it works both ways. And
I'm just making a comment. I think.
Thank you.
It's very unlikely.
Jed, you want to comment geographically?
Following from that, which department will lead on the role of immigration in future negotiations? Will it be the Home Office or the Department for International Trade?
It will be the Home Office.
And we can move on now to GIs. Under the provisions related to GIs within the withdrawal agreement, will Scottish GIs receive the same standard of protection as they currently receive in the EU post-Brexit?
Okay, so I think that's a sort of nicety to that question. Let me just say that GIs are extraordinarily important to the UK government. They are, in effect, it's sort of a shortcut route to intellectual property. It is, in effect, one of many, many versions of intellectual property. And we believe they are extremely important to those companies and those producers who have achieved them in an EU context. In each individual market case, it will be entirely up to companies to decide whether or not they wish to try and protect themselves in those markets, and that will be a combination of all sorts of issues. I suspect, given the option, any company would want to be protected in every market if it could, but the nicety is not the nicest, but the difficulties of free trade arrangements means that trying to put in place every single GI that the UK has, even if the company and or the protected name has no business in that country, might mean that it is simply not worthwhile because of the trades one might have to make, the gifts one might produce to make that happen. But where any single producer across the UK has an interest in a market, where they have sales going to that market, where there's intellectual property through the GI being protected, and we will discuss that with the individual companies and or people who enjoy that privilege, and attempt to deliver what it is that they want. So the answer is we will do the best we can. We will have our own version of a GI. We can't just simply duplicate exactly what is there at the moment. There will be a UK distinct version of it, and that most certainly will take account of Scottish interests. Some of the most important GIs in the UK are Scottish. Of course, we all know the example of Scotch whisky, and I have to tell you that pretty much every single time I do an overseas trip, there was a request from Diageo or others, or the Scotch Whisky Association, to be doing something on their behalf, and it's something I do extremely gladly. It is a very, very important business to the UK, and should absolutely be afforded protection. It's also worth noting, Mr Wishart, that of course in some areas GIs are simply not necessary because there is another arrangement in place that already does the same job. And it would be a strange thing to do to replicate protection. One wouldn't quite know where to go for arbitration and so on and so forth. So if a spirits agreement is in place with third country X, there's little or no point in using the GI for that particular protection.
And will the necessary domestic legislation and institutions be in place to recognise the EU's GIs in the UK by March 2019?
Well, I think it is the case, and I will allow the Secretary of State to correct me here if I'm wrong, but the schedule for the GIs, is it included in the withdrawal agreement? I forget exactly. It doesn't matter. In either case, if there is no deal, then I presume there is no acceptance of the GI schedule, but perhaps I'll let the...
Well, it's an area where if there were... I mean, clearly, I think as is well known, there's a legislative programme which would proceed on the basis of there being a deal, and there's a legislative programme that would proceed on the basis of there not being a deal, and if there is not a deal, there would require to be a different legislative approach, but there would be one.
And lastly, what will happen to GIs which are approved in the UK after the implementation period? Will they be registered in the EU?
Well, that will depend on the nature. I mean, obviously, that is dependent on the nature of the ongoing agreement that we have reached with the EU in terms of what is the detail ultimately of the future partnership agreement.
Josh Thompson.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you for your answer there, Minister. You rightfully mentioned that whisky is a big Scottish export, and Diageo, who I know who have been engaging with MPs across party, and that big markets for them are US and India. The withdrawal agreement, as it stands, recognises and protects over 3,000 GIs. So that's recognising GIs such as Parma ham or feta cheese. And my understanding is that this can prevent us from signing a free trade agreement with third countries such as the US or India, because we have those protections for products which are made in Italy or Greece or whatever. Now, a GI can be protected for Scotch whisky in that bilateral, And these are big markets for us. And we do need to protect our own GIs, but why are we protecting the GIs of others when it could actually get us in the way of getting this fantastic Scottish product into the US and India?
And of course, in the end, we only... I'm not sure about the read across to a US FTA of recognising EU GIs in the UK market. I'm not sure. Perhaps I'm missing something, and I may be. I may be, but I'm just thinking about the read across there. I think it's fair to say that the US has a different attitude to these geographic indicators, and feta cheese is the absolutely principal one that we all know about. I'm afraid I'm sufficiently ignorant as to the absolute tenets of TTIP to know what was done with GIs in TTIP. I don't know if anyone, perhaps the members of the committee actually know. But let us just say that the United States managed to sign, or at least get to a point where there was agreement on between the EU and the US, where of course EU GIs must have been part of the mix. Maybe they were just missed out, but I doubt it. The simple fact of free trade agreements is that people will use offensive and defensive interests to create complex bargains across the piece, which may not necessarily be that easy to follow. And you may well find that a give on bicycles allows you to have something on the other side that is actually hardly not connected with bicycles at all, but may be very useful in another regard. And the same can happen on GIs. So I think there are still plenty of ways in which we can do that agreement with the United States, with keeping our own GI schedules and making sure that we protect the interests of our, well, not modest number, but a less extensive number of GIs than is available to some countries across Europe. I believe that is a problem that can be surmounted and got around.
In terms of the GIs, I mean, I understand that the EU has said that they could never legally enter into negotiations with us on the future relationship until we've actually left, which is why we're at this stage with the withdrawal agreement before we go into negotiations on the future partnership. However, GIs are fundamentally part of anything that you would discuss down the line as part of any future arrangement. So the fact that we're protecting over 3,000, many of them EU GIs already at this stage, that sounds like the EU are cherry-picking about when they want to enter into meaningful discussions with us on that future trading relationship. Why have we agreed that at this stage when actually GIs probably should have happened further down the line?
Well, I hate to duck once again, Mr. Chairman. But in the end, it's a part of a negotiation, and presumably it was required, but I can only comment around future trade negotiations. I'm not part of the Brexit department. Has the Secretary said anything to add on that?
No, I mean, that's been, the structure of the negotiation. It was a point which, I mean, has been subject, I think, to some previous parliamentary discussion, scrutiny, and ultimately in the negotiation, it is an agreement between the two sides, and that's where that landed.
Just on that, because I think Mr Thompson's on to something. Was there not an offer made by Michel Barnier about reciprocity when it came to GIs, that we would be prepared to recognise European Union GIs if they recognised ours, and our arrangement would roughly be the same, but that was turned down by the UK government, I suspect, because of the question that was asked by Mr Thompson. Would that be a fair representation of what happened?
Well, my view, Mr Wishart, is that even at this stage we have the result of a negotiation, and there are plenty of positions which the EU started off with, which in my view are rather more fundamental than whether or not GIs are recognised, that the EU has moved substantially on, perhaps not to some people's satisfaction, but nevertheless very substantially moved.
Could I suggest that we really need to hear more from... I mean, GIs are so significant and important for...
Of course they are enormously significant to trade, but we're talking about fundamental constitutional issues, and you'll forgive me for thinking that whilst my entire life is taken up with protecting British interests abroad and making sure that we have the trading arrangements we need and making sure our companies are represented and we get through trade barriers, we deal with and so on and so forth. There are some moments in our history when we have to look at constitutional issues as well. And whilst Mr Thompson and I probably disagree on the outcome of the outputs of where we've ended up, the EU moved its position substantially on some very major issues, constitutional issues, which they said would have to be a certain way before they would ever really talk to us. We may have moved on GIs. Do I think that's important? Of course it's important. It's terribly important in my area. And actually, frankly, could make my life a little more difficult. But the fact is that some of the areas that the EU moved on from their initial positions were also very substantial, even if not to everybody's entire satisfaction.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we're a little bit clearer. Deirdre Brock.
I just wanted to follow up on something that you said in front of the Finance Committee in Scotland recently, Minister. and it's about GI, and it says something along the lines of what you've been saying. In most free trade deals, certainly the ones I've looked at recently, you have to demonstrate a certain level of penetration into market and or desire amongst consumers for that GI to gain protection. So on the whole, quite a few UK GIs which we promote fail that test when going to the Japanese market or, say, the South Korean market. Whisky, no problem at all. Amazingly, blue and white Stilton actually quite often get through, but there are several others which we would like to protect which just don't have sufficient penetration to warrant GI status in that market. Would GI products like Scotch beef and Scotch lamb be included within those examples that you suggest don't have sufficient penetration to warrant GI status?
I'm afraid I don't have. I don't have the actual figures per market. I haven't talked personally with those producers, and indeed, perhaps someone can illuminate me. Perhaps I should certainly know. Maybe I need to find out for myself exactly how each GI is represented to the UK government, and I think that is something I should take away from this committee and understand that I need to do more of, not just in the Scottish context, in all contexts, about where that contact point is about the use of Scottish beef or Scottish lamb and so on and so forth. I would say that having been in my post a little longer, I think I can reflect that the process is a little more subtle than I perhaps outlined on that day. Okay. One learns in these jobs, I'm afraid, and my understanding was pretty much correct. What I said was pretty much correct, but I think it's more iterative. It's more about talking to the businesses and working out where they may need protection, where they believe that their unique brand, we can use that as a shortcut for geographic indicator, I'll be pleased, because that's effectively what it is. The intellectual property of Scotch beef, where it is felt to be really important and a real stimulus for sales from the people for whom it really matters, is what we need to find out first. And that is what should drive us to trying to negotiate those GIs.
Indeed. Well, of course, I would imagine that everyone who supports Scotch beef and Scotch lamb would think that it is important in every trade deal that is being discussed to promote those particular areas. Wouldn't you agree, Secretary of State?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's always. I think it is. Look, I think it is always important to make sure that every business that will be affected has its chance to reflect to the UK government in making its negotiating mandates which GIs are important. Now, if the Scotch Beef Industry or Association came through discussion with us to make its case that in every one of those 4 agreements the Scotch Beef GI is important to their business, then of course we will work in negotiations to protect it. If they say to us that at the moment that it is not, we need you to negotiate to put in a way of putting in new GIs, if it comes to the point where we start exporting to that market, that might be another alternative. So I'm simply saying here that there are, perhaps the puzzle face isn't required.
Yeah.
It simply isn't required. I am simply reflecting to you the reality of the world. Not every product is exported to every part of the world where one might do a GI. In that case, there is actually not a trade flow to protect. As long as one can negotiate, as one often can, the ability to put new GIs onto the block when they matter, when there is actually something to protect, then that is another way forward. So I'm simply saying to you that there are different ways of doing this.
And I think the reality, or the practical reality, is the industry has not over recent times been concerned about so much the brand as the ability to access markets, particularly a market like the US, because other requirements have been put in, phytosanitary requirements, for example, which has excluded British and Scottish meat products from many markets in recent years, and that has been, in my discussions with Quality Meat Scotland and the other industry, it is getting these barriers down that has been absolutely their priority.
I have to say, rather embarrassingly, that's a very, very, very good answer. It's exactly right. Wherever I've been around the world, there are indeed barriers, particularly to meat products, which have been very difficult. And when I went to Taiwan, you were asking earlier about what's the use of people going abroad, and what do you get out of them. One of the articulation points that
measurable benefits.
My visit provided an articulation point which had to be met by both sides negotiating, which allowed that meeting pork to be readmitted to Taiwan. I can't say the exact financial repercussions of that will be felt over the next 5 to 10 years. One can't tell immediately because one has to access supply chains and underdo quality checks and market and so on and so forth. But certainly the priority at the moment in many markets, particularly for beef, pork and other meat products, has been access at all. The Secretary of State is exactly correct.
Okay.
It was, I suppose, just something quickly about the US and indeed Australia, I believe, as well, tends to favour a trademark approach rather than PGIs or GIs. Do you... we had a GI expert, Dr. Gail Evans, who came to the committee and suggested that the government might consider adopting the approach used in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Can I ask, have there been investigations of that model, whereby both trademarks and GIs are potentially recognised? Has that sort of model been investigated by?
The honest truth is I don't know. It has not crossed my desk if it has, and I've not thought to ask the question. But I think it reflects what I said in my remarks only a few moments ago, which is that in the end, GIs are a form of intellectual property, and it just depends how you want to protect that intellectual property as to what form you use. And it seems to me that is an alternative. It is simply exemplifying what I said. This is about a brand value, and that is protected in many different ways. Or can be.
Thank you. Daniel Rowley.
Minister, could I ask you to provide us with an update on what progress the government has made in terms of rolling over the EU's existing trade agreements by March 2019, and is the government confident that that will happen in time?
So I could just refer you to the remarks I made to the International Trade Committee only last week, but I'm very happy to summarise here,
yes, please.
Which is that there are 40 agreements which we wish to transition under the auspices of DIT. There are, of course, a great many others, led by all sorts of different departments for different reasons. In our department, we are making very good progress with quite a large number of deals, but there are some which are unquestionably more problematic, and I don't think it's any secret that if we leave the EU without a deal, there are going to be members of the customs union who are not necessarily members of the EU, with whom it is going to be difficult to strike an immediate agreement. That is simply a complication that I think is hugely awarenable. There are differing motivations in some of these deals. You might imagine there are some deals out there that are with larger countries than us, or certainly countries at a similar level of development and of GDP, where there is an appetite to change some of these agreements. It's hardly surprising. A deal was struck with a group that represents 500 million people, and we represent 70 million, therefore there is an appetite for change. Amongst many other agreements, we are making very, very good progress indeed. And down at the development end of the spectrum, the EPAs, you would again not be terribly surprised to know that the arrangement that is they currently enjoy, an asymmetric development stage agreement, is something which they are very keen to replicate, and we are very close with a lot of those. There are at the same time some real complexities, and I am just going to take a little bit of the committee's time just to illustrate how complex it is to transition some of these arrangements. There are changing incentives, and have been across the 2 years we've undertaken this programme. There's been significant uncertainty about the motivation of the implementation period, and indeed even uncertainty about whether that would exist until December last year, about the emphasis on no deal, then back to implementation period, and so on and so forth. There are complex partners. Some of our partners are groups of quite large numbers of countries, and as you might imagine, they don't necessarily always get on all the time, and they're finding unanimity across some of these groupings can be quite challenging. Some of them have very clear lack of resource. One partner country with whom we wish to transition told us they couldn't speak to us for a month and a half because they were busy doing local elections, and all the officials that were available would be off doing that. So just to give you a flavour of the difficulties. Some don't wish to incentivise us to do no deal by having an emergency brake in place, and want us to make every effort to try and put a deal in place. I have some sympathy with that position. Some are having elections, and that particularly matters again in some of these composite agreements, multilateral agreements, where one party simply can't say yes because there isn't a government to say yes at the moment. There are ratification issues about how long these can take. There are asymmetries, and so on and so forth. I don't want to bore the committee to death, but there is a reason why some of these are taking quite a long time. So, to the direct question, I believe we will transition the majority of these agreements. I believe that amongst our major trading partners, when there is some genuine certainty as to whether or not no deal looks very likely, the stars will align quickly to put measures in place. I think it is quite likely that some of those agreements may have periods in which exceed March 29th. This is simply because of practicality, ratification timetables and so on and so forth. But I believe that we will, in the end, if we have the event of a no-deal Brexit, have the majority of these in place.
And Chair, I know we almost got onto the backstop before and not quite, but could I ask, what will trading options be if the backstop is implemented? And perhaps the Secretary of State could say what the economic consequences will be for Scotland if there are different trade rules for Northern Ireland.
Well, I firstly, I think we have to acknowledge that Northern Ireland has different arrangements right now. There are different arrangements applying in Northern Ireland because of, for example, the single electricity market, arrangements that have been related to the Belfast agreement. So I don't think that it is, it is an appropriate comparator with Scotland, and I reject the line of argument that says because of Northern Ireland's unique circumstances that have developed through a lot of very significant issues in the past, that somehow Northern Ireland is being given an advantage over Scotland. I think that is a wholly false argument. I think what we're trying to do in the backstop is deal with very specific circumstances that exist in Northern Ireland, and I think it's been very difficult, but something that can be lived with has been achieved, and I don't think that it will be to the detriment of Scotland. I think, in fact, in keeping Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom, ensuring that there isn't a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland is to the advantage of Scotland.
Will trade be different between Northern Ireland and Europe than the rest of the UK, particularly Scotland and Europe?
Well, by the very fact of being on the island of Ireland, by having a single electricity market, by being in the same phytosanitary area for agriculture and agricultural products, and the Republic of Ireland being within the EU, then it will.
So, what consequences will that have for Scotland?
Well, I don't think that it will have. I don't think that it will have significant detrimental consequences for Scotland, because that is the situation as it is right now. But I reject the comparison of Scotland to Northern Ireland and arrangements for Scotland compared to Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland has these very specific circumstances which the backstop is seeking to address.
Fitri Brock and then Ross
Just
Thompson.
very quickly, the Attorney General said yesterday that firms in Northern Ireland would be advantaged by this arrangement, so I'm interested to hear you disagree with the Attorney General's opinion.
I'm not disagreeing with him, but I am disagreeing with you, Ms Brock, and the First Minister in the way that you've sought to draw the specific issues that have come about by very difficult circumstances.
I don't really see how you're now putting that onto myself and the First Minister.
I am, because in trying to take forward the issue of Scottish nationalism, what you are doing is trying to draw in Northern Ireland into the debate about Scottish nationalism, and I wholly reject that.
Is the Attorney General doing that?
I reject that.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, okay, we'll leave it there, but that's...
Mr Thompson.
On that point, I couldn't agree more with the Secretary of State for Scotland. On the point of the Northern Irish backstop, you're absolutely right about there being the single electricity market. There's the livestock area. But the Northern Irish Protocol does go an awful lot further, because we now apply it to products, so there'll be full harmonisation, which goes further than what we've got right now if you look at the annexes of the withdrawal agreement. And that does provide for customs controls between GB and Northern Ireland, very similar to the Turkish model, with the production and issuing of certificates, goods going between GB and Northern Ireland. And given that 61% of products coming into Northern Ireland come from GB, are you not concerned about, on all those products and agri-foods, the production of these new certificates, that is creating something new which we don't have within the UK internal market already?
Well, I think, as I'm clear, I think, as you know, the Prime Minister is clear. We don't want to be in the backstop. The backstop is there as an arrangement to ensure that if we haven't reached our future trading agreement by the end of 2020, then there are arrangements in place which don't bring about, intentionally or otherwise, a hard border in Northern Ireland. There are a lot of checks which currently take place or could take place in relation to goods moving between Ireland and Northern Ireland and GB. And going forward, we don't want to be in the position, which is why we want this to be covered in the future trade arrangement. We don't want an increase in those differences that currently exist. We don't want to be in that position. As my colleague, the Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster, has suggested when he appeared before the Scottish Parliament, we would seek on a regulatory basis to align with any changes that were required to come into place in Northern Ireland in order to try and minimise that process. But whether we agree or not on the fundamentals, I hope you will agree that it is the aspiration of the government to minimise the backstop and minimise the opportunity for differences or extra regulation and bureaucracy to arise.
Grateful. I just think you were a little bit unfair to Ms Brock for raising the very legitimate issue of a possible unfairness to Scotland with the backstop arrangement for Northern Ireland. But we'll maybe leave that aside just now. And I just want you to as a final question, just to answer this. Under any scenario, leaving the European Union's Scottish business and trade is going to suffer. The Scottish Government say up to £9 billion. The Treasury say something different. I'm not entirely sure what the Treasury figure is, though we're aware that the Treasury doesn't factor immigration into its assumptions. Could you perhaps just conclude this particular session by saying that you understand that there will be an issue and a hit for Scottish business and Scottish trade, and that you, as the Secretary of State for Scotland, as these negotiations are going to be going forward, will be doing everything possible to ensure that this will be mitigated?
I will be doing everything that I can to ensure that Scotland gets the best outcome from these negotiations. And the first step, Mr Wishart, in securing that is to vote for the Prime Minister's deal next Tuesday, and I would hope all members of this committee would find themselves able to do that.
And lastly, Mr Hollingbury, we've had a little conversation just about some of the arrangements if we are leaving without a deal. There now does seem to be a sort of cross-party initiative to ensure that we wouldn't be leaving without that. What is your assessment of leaving without a deal, and how will this impact on Scottish trade and business?
The Department for International Trade has a number of responsibilities to anticipate what would happen in a no-deal scenario. We believe that we are ready as a department, that we have considered all the issues that will arise, both for companies and indeed straightforward in trade policy terms, and that we will be ready. So that is our mandate for a no-deal scenario, is to be ready, to ensure that we get the machinery in place such that we can operate a trade policy, and I believe we will.
I know there's not much time left, so just briefly, I see the government has recently launched a grant scheme to support UK businesses prepare for customs declarations post-Brexit. I don't know if that particularly falls into your responsibilities. It
doesn't, but the simple fact is that there is a large amount of information ready to go, let's put it that way, that we already have the various, I forget what the exact name is, but the various documents that have been put out to help business prepare and indeed citizens prepare for a no-deal scenario. As and when there is more certainty one way or the other. There is a lot of work that has been done to ensure that everybody will have a detailed idea as to what it is, in trade at least, that the intention is across all of government, but we can only be responsible for the trade part, that those documents are ready and will be available for citizens and indeed for companies to understand the new systems if they need to do so.
Great. And thank you ever so much on your first appearance in the Scottish Affairs Committee. You'll be welcome back again in the future. And thank you once again, Secretary of State. I believe we'll have you in the near future to discuss Scotland Office activities.
Will I be welcome back?
You will certainly will, as always, Secretary of State. And thank you both for your appearance today. Order, order.
The Grimmond Room. The proceeding has ended.